Another popular animal product in South Africa is poultry meat. And right now, that $20 billion market sits at the very center of a trade disagreement with the United States that nobody saw coming. The US has been warning South Africa that it could lose a lucrative trade deal if it doesn't open up that market. But what happened next shocked Washington, American chicken exporters, and trade analysts around the world. For the first time in decades, an African nation has stood up and said enough is enough. And the consequences are already rippling through both continents in ways that could change everything about how we think about global trade, American influence, and the future of food security. Welcome back. And if you've been following American foreign policy and trade relationships over the past 50 years, you know that the United States has built its global influence, not just through military might or diplomatic pressure, but through economic relationships that seemed unshakable. American agricultural exports have been a cornerstone of that strategy, feeding nations around the world while supporting American farmers and agribusiness here at home. For generations, this system worked smoothly. We produced more than we could consume, especially in poultry, and we found eager markets overseas. African nations imported our chicken, our wheat, our corn, and everyone seemed to benefit. But something fundamental has shifted, and South Africa's recent decision to block American chicken imports represents a turning point that should concern every American who cares about our country's place in the world economy. The dispute between South Africa and the United States over chicken import duties has been simmering for years, hanging over South Africa's participation in something called the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which you might know as AGOA. This isn't some obscure trade agreement that only matters to Washington bureaucrats. AGOA has been one of America's most important tools for maintaining influence and building partnerships across Africa since the year 2000. It allows African nations to export thousands of products to the United States duty-free, which means their goods can compete in our markets without the heavy taxes that would otherwise make them too expensive. In return, we expected these nations to open their markets to American products. It seemed like a fair exchange. A partnership that would lift African economies while supporting American exports and maintaining our strategic presence on a continent that matters more every single year. But here's what happened, and why it matters so much right now. For decades, American chicken producers have been shipping what we call leg quarters, wings, and other dark meat cuts to African markets at prices that local farmers simply cannot match. Now, before you think this is just about American efficiency and superior farming techniques, you need to understand the full picture. Americans overwhelmingly prefer white meat, chicken breasts, and tenders, which means our poultry industry produces enormous quantities of dark meat that we don't consume domestically. Rather than waste it, we ship it overseas. Our producers benefit from massive scale, advanced technology, and yes, government subsidies that help keep prices low. When these chicken parts arrive in places like South Africa, they're often cheaper than what local farmers can produce, even though those farmers are working in their own backyards with their own resources. For South African poultry farmers, this has been nothing short of devastating. Imagine spending your life building a farm, investing in equipment, hiring workers, raising birds, and trying to compete fairly in your own country's market, only to watch foreign chicken flood the supermarkets at prices you simply cannot match, no matter how efficient you become. It's not a level playing field, and South African farmers have been saying this for years. They've pleaded with their government for protection, warning that cheap imports make it impossible to scale production or compete. They've argued passionately that local farmers can produce enough chicken for the entire nation if given fair market conditions, and they've watched their costs rise while imports keep prices artificially low, limiting their ability to grow, invest, or even survive. After years of negotiations, trade disputes, economic studies, and mounting pressure from local agricultural associations, South Africa finally made a decision that sent shockwaves through Washington. The government announced new measures effectively blocking American chicken imports, citing concerns about unfair pricing, economic strain on local farmers, and the critical need to protect national food security. The announcement triggered immediate celebrations among South African poultry associations and farmer unions who have spent years fighting for this moment. But in the United States, the reaction was very different. American chicken exporters suddenly faced a $450 million loss, representing not just canceled contracts but disrupted supply chains, uncertain futures for American poultry workers, and shipping companies facing routes that no longer make economic sense. Now, $450 million might not sound like much when we talk about trillion-dollar federal budgets, but in the agricultural sector, this represents thousands of American jobs, entire communities built around poultry processing, and a significant blow to an industry that has relied heavily on export markets to absorb production that exceeds domestic consumption. More importantly, this loss represents something that should worry every American who remembers when our country's economic influence was unquestioned. This is about America's slipping grip on markets we once dominated, and it's happening at a moment when China, Russia, and other powers are aggressively expanding their own influence across Africa. The timing of South Africa's decision couldn't be more significant. Across the African continent right now, nations are implementing policies that favor local production over foreign imports. Countries like Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, and Ghana are all moving in similar directions, rejecting economic patterns that kept them dependent and vulnerable for generations. The logic is straightforward and hard to argue with. If African nations produce their own food, they keep their money within their borders, they control their own prices, they create jobs for their own people, and they build industries that can sustain them for generations, instead of remaining perpetually dependent on foreign suppliers who may or may not have their best interests at heart. What makes South Africa's move particularly significant is that this isn't some small, struggling nation making a desperate play for attention. South Africa has one of the most advanced and diversified economies on the African continent. It has sophisticated financial markets, strong institutions, and deep trade relationships around the world. When a country like South Africa makes this kind of bold move, other nations pay attention. When South Africa shows that it's possible to stand up to American economic pressure and survive, even thrive, other countries start wondering if they should follow suit. And that's exactly what has American trade officials deeply concerned right now. Washington's reaction reveals just how unexpected and concerning this development really is. American officials have long operated under the assumption that African nations depend on U.S. imports for quality, affordability, and market stability. That assumption, built up over decades of trade relationships, has now been fundamentally challenged. Analysts immediately began warning that other African countries might follow South Africa's example, and if that happens, the United States could lose billions of dollars across not just agriculture but technology, mining, and manufacturing exports as well. Beyond the immediate financial losses, America risks something even more valuable and harder to rebuild, which is influence itself. For generations, the United States has used trade relationships as a strategic tool, maintaining strong partnerships through agricultural exports, development aid programs, and bilateral agreements that tied countries to American economic interests. When African nations begin standing on their own economically, when they start making decisions that prioritize their own industries over American exports, the entire power dynamic shifts in ways that can't be easily reversed. What we're witnessing now isn't just a trade dispute over chicken. It's a fundamental shift in how African countries see themselves and their place in the global economy. They're no longer accepting the role of perpetual consumer, always buying from others, always dependent on foreign producers. They're asserting their right to protect their markets, strengthen their own farmers, and build their own industries without asking permission from Washington or any other foreign capital. The financial losses for American exporters are substantial and real, affecting real American workers and communities. But the symbolic loss cuts even deeper. South Africa didn't just impose tariffs or negotiate better terms. It fundamentally challenged the status quo that has governed global agricultural trade for decades. It raised a flag declaring that African markets should primarily serve African producers, and this message is resonating far beyond agricultural policy circles. This is about economic sovereignty, about developing nations refusing to accept arrangements that keep them perpetually disadvantaged, about countries choosing long-term development over short-term convenience. Meanwhile, in South Africa itself, local farmers are experiencing something many never thought they'd see in their lifetimes. They're seeing genuine opportunity, real hope that their businesses can finally compete on equal footing. For years, these farmers pleaded for protection. explaining in detail how subsidized imports made it impossible for them to scale production or invest in expansion. They demonstrated again and again that given fair market conditions, South African producers could meet domestic demand entirely. Now, with American imports removed from the equation, South African poultry companies are rapidly increasing production, hiring new workers, and fast-tracking expansion projects that were previously considered too risky because of foreign competition. Local feed suppliers are getting more business. Transportation companies are moving more domestically produced goods. Rural communities that depend heavily on agriculture are feeling an immediate economic boost. This isn't just nationalist sentiment or protectionist economics for its own sake. This represents a genuine development strategy aimed at creating stronger, more resilient agricultural systems that don't collapse when global supply chains get disrupted, that don't depend on the goodwill of foreign governments, and that support local businesses and communities from the ground up. Of course, the United States argues that South Africa's decision violates principles of free trade and harms global economic efficiency. But South Africans respond with a point that's difficult to dismiss. Free trade isn't truly free when powerful countries can heavily subsidize their agricultural sectors while developing nations cannot afford to do the same. Sometimes, leveling the playing field requires protection, requires strategic barriers that give local industries space and time to develop before facing full international competition. This situation highlights fundamental questions about global economics that Americans of a certain generation remember debating intensely during the trade policy fights of the 1,980 and 1,990. Questions about fairness, about who really benefits from global trade deals, about whether free trade principles apply equally to all nations or only serve the interests of those already powerful enough to dominate markets. It also highlights how tired African nations have become of playing supporting roles in the global economy, exporting raw materials while importing finished products at higher costs, watching wealth flow steadily outward while their own industries struggle to develop. By blocking American chicken imports, South Africa is taking one concrete step toward breaking that pattern, toward building an economy that serves its own people first. But there are political dimensions here that extend well beyond economics, and these should concern Americans who remember the Cold War and understand how quickly geopolitical alignments can shift. South Africa has been strengthening its ties with the BRICS nations. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa itself, pushing for a more multipolar world order that doesn't automatically defer to American leadership. The United States sees this as a direct challenge to the international order we've worked so hard to maintain since 1945. Now, with a decision that directly damages American business interests, political commentators are arguing that South Africa is leaning even further away from American influence and toward alternative alliances that could reshape global power dynamics in ways that leave America on the outside looking in. Washington understands that losing economic ground almost always leads to losing political leverage. That's why this $450 million loss feels so much larger than the number suggests. It's a warning sign that African countries are no longer predictable, no longer automatically aligned with American interests, no longer obliged to follow Washington's economic direction. They're starting to play by their own rules, and once that process begins, it's extremely difficult to reverse. For Americans who built their careers and understanding of the world on the assumption of American preeminence, this shift feels deeply unsettling, like watching the ground shift beneath our feet. What happens next could determine whether this moment represents a temporary disruption or the beginning of a fundamental realignment in global trade relationships. If South Africa maintains this policy for even a year or two, if local poultry production expands successfully, if food prices remain stable or even decrease as domestic competition intensifies, other African nations will be watching carefully and drawing their own conclusions. Kenya could reconsider American corn imports. Nigeria might restrict American wheat. Ghana could limit American frozen foods. Once African nations realize they can take back control and benefit from doing so, the momentum could become unstoppable. And American exporters could find themselves shut out of markets we've dominated for generations. This is more than a trade issue. This represents a geopolitical shift that should matter to every American who cares about our country's future influence and prosperity. South Africa took a step that many nations consider, but few have the courage to implement. It challenged American economic power directly, and it did so with confidence, not as an act of desperation, but as a calculated strategic decision. For the United States, the choices now are difficult and the path forward unclear. Retaliation risks pushing South Africa further away and damaging whatever political relationship remains. But acceptance means acknowledging a decline in influence that many Americans, particularly those who remember our unchallenged dominance after World War II and the Cold War, find difficult to accept. What's certain is that the world is watching this situation very closely, and African leaders are watching most closely of all, wondering if they too should follow South Africa's example and choose sovereignty over dependency, even if it means confronting American economic power directly.